Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
What's up? What's down? What is going on around? I'm Paolo Leasing, founder of startupintaiwan.com. This show is to answer your questions about starting up in Taiwan, either for business, school, or just hanging around. So leave your questions in the comment section below. Our guest for today is Mr. Mark Xu, a Taiwanese-American entrepreneur and investor who has been in Asia since 1996. He's a Stanford graduate. Mark is currently running a portfolio of companies in education, e-commerce, and internet-enabled services. Our topic for today is funding options for startups in Taiwan. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Mark, first question. Why did you decide to come back to Taiwan after spending many years in the US?
Yeah. I mean, I get this question a lot. You know, it was a different era. Keep in mind, this was 1996, kind of internet one, pre-India, pre-China, pre-BRIC. So back then, you know, the 4 Asian or 5 Asian tigers were the were the hot thing, right? Taiwan was experiencing something like 30 years of 8% GDP growth. So having grown up in the suburbs of San Francisco, where things seemed like stagnant, and then returning to Taiwan, seeing the infrastructure build out. You know, keep in mind, 1996 there was no MRT, so you know, that all seemed very, very like exciting, and so that's how I landed in Taiwan back in '96. Yeah.
Okay, so you've been very visible in the Taiwan startup community. Could you tell us more about your roles in this specific niche?
Sure. Like I said, I've been here a while, 25 years plus. So I think I've worn many hats. So like when in my 20s, during Internet One, late 90s, early 2000, I was the entrepreneur. So I was part of companies that later became Sina, which is less well known now, but it was kind of part of the first generation Internet 1.0 Chinese internet companies. And then I also co-founded a company that was a predecessor company to KKBox.
Wow.
We call it, yeah. So that was kind of I was the first thing I did was I started my own businesses. So that. Then I moved on to kind of a series of small businesses in education. So lest, I guess this happened, post the Internet One bust. Yes. So what happened, for the younger kind of listeners is, Internet One kind of lasted till from like 94 to 2000, and then 2001 NASDAQ hit 5,000 and came crashing down, and then a lot of chatter about how huge bust, right? And so from post 2001 onwards, I did kind of my own thing, and then I kind of returned to this kind of nascent ecosystem around 2009, 2010. And that's when I thought that this is going to happen globally, right? And then at some point it would come to Taiwan. But at that time, I kind of I was in kind of my late 30s, and I thought, well, I don't want to be like pulling all-nighters anymore, but I try my hand at investing. And so that's the second phase of this kind of a connection to the startup ecosystem was starting as an angel investor, circa 2010. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So related to that, are you? Is there any specific area that you're looking for when it comes to investing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like to think of myself as an entrepreneur operator first. So I think see an investment through that lens, and the way I look at things is what value can I add, right? And then number two, I think specifically is because we're based in Taiwan, right? So I think there has to be a sort of a geographic reason, right? I tell people all the time that if you're doing cutting edge stuff, you probably should be in Silicon Valley, right? Because that's the epicenter of like tech innovation. So, but I'm not there. I'm here kind of, for various reasons by choice, right? Okay. So then I think for an idea to be based out of Taiwan, you have to think what is what is the edge that you're bringing to the table, right? And so I think I'm looking for entrepreneurs who have a good answer for that. And then third, of course, is kind of the age-old cliche that startups, everything's about people. And to be frank, I think I've also been burned on the investment side. And so now I get it. I get why it's about the people, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm at the early stages, right? There's no data, right? It's really a bet on that entrepreneur. Yeah.
Okay. So since most of our audience is like a foreigner, have you invested in a foreign-led startup?
Yeah, actually I have. So like from a geographic perspective, my investments have been, into Singaporean companies, US companies, Taiwanese companies, and even French and New Zealand companies. So in terms of, having invest out of, someone who's non-Taiwanese, obviously I'm comfortable with that. And then specifically in Taiwan, actually many of the companies we backed were Taiwanese-Americans. And also I actually backed like an Australian guy who was living out in Kaohsiung,
Wow.
7-8 years ago, right? So so I'm kind of agnostic as to like the entrepreneur's origins or background, right?
Okay. So you have also created like a website that seeks to help visas for foreigners and global Taiwanese. So when we say global Taiwanese, someone like you, those described by the government as dual citizens returning from abroad. Could you tell us more about why you created this?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're referring to probably some of the content on 11th Fleet, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, 11th Fleet is kind of my latest startup, and it really kind of grew as a sort of as an outreach or a culmination of my experience as an entrepreneur, as an investor in the startup community. And what I realized that is, or I learned firsthand, is just that Taiwan, and in many places outside of Silicon Valley, is really missing an ecosystem, right? The reason that people or startups can move so quickly in Silicon Valley is that you could almost outsource, critical functions, but non-core, right? Such as legal, accounting, finance, whatnot, right? But there are very few places in the world, and certainly not in Taiwan, where you can outsource these services to like a professional who understands the needs of a startup. So that was the original idea of Lem Fleet. And then tangential to that was also trying to help people, startups, clients identify talent. Of course, what happened was the timing wasn't great, or no one saw COVID coming, and so then COVID hit, and then what happened was then we had to quickly come up with a plan B, and so the whole visa thing really came about because people weren't really like that shock to the system. All the calls and emails just kind of stopped, and then our plan B was, okay, we realized that there were a lot of people kind of stranded in Taiwan, and they needed help to figure out their visa status. And then there were foreigners, and there were also Taiwanese-Americans. Right. And so then we kind of pivoted and said, well, since we're not going to get new business in terms of the original idea for a while, then we started figuring out, how to help people with a visa. And then now in retrospect, it's now very crystal clear, because like what we learned from the Lem Fleet experience is that if the person that we're talking to is not familiar with Taiwan, then most likely, even if you like kind of espouse like all the great things about Taiwan, they can't relate, right? Because they haven't been. And so then in hindsight, it's really a funnel, right? Like you could only provide kind of these professional services to people who have already decided that they want to be based in Taiwan. But for them to be based in Taiwan, they need to have to find a way to settle here on a more permanent basis. And so now, of course, visa is part of these services, because now we see it very clearly that you need to resolve the residency issue first before we can move on to the other issues.
Yes. And just to hammer on our topic, which is about funding, I know that you have also helped a lot of startups with their application for government grants. Could you tell us how the grants in Taiwan work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be clear, I mean, we talk a lot about grants, but very few people actually go through it. Part of it is it's really a cumbersome process. But we talk about it just so that people know that there's a resource that's out there. So in a nutshell, I think the way the grants work in Taiwan is it all comes from the central government, and then the central government then kind of pushes the money to something like 9 different national agencies, and most prominent among these are probably Ministry of Economic Affairs or Ministry of Technology, and then culture, and then agriculture, right? So basically, depending on what type of startup you're doing, right, then you figure out, okay, who is the most likely supporter of your startup, right, from a government standpoint. So if you're making film, obviously, then you go to the Department of Culture, right? And then if you're doing something like maybe food tech related, you go to agriculture. But by and large, I think most service, kind of businesses or kind of tech enabled would go into Ministry of Economics or Ministry of Technology. And then further down, the agencies themselves don't decide. That work is usually farmed out to organizations like eTree or Triple I or some other kind of a nonprofit or semi-government, semi-private organization. And then as an entrepreneur, you'd go apply for the various grants, right? So that is kind of the overview, and then it really depends on the type of startup that you're running, and then you have to navigate, so like what agency should you be kind of talking to, right?
Yes. And speaking of navigations, there are, I'm sure a lot of people have some misconceptions about obtaining such grants. Are there any like
Yeah.
misconceptions that you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is like, it's a very Taiwanese style. So the one is like, if you do get the grants, they're not, it's definitely not a blank check. So it's really largely reimbursement based. And most of it, with almost all types of grants, the bulk of the money goes to reimbursement for salaries. So I think the government really wants you to hire, right? And then they'll, if you hire, they're happy to reimburse something like 40% of this monthly salary up to a certain cap, right? So that's the important thing. It's not like, oh, okay, you apply for a grant, you get 3 million and you can do whatever you want with it. So definitely, as far as I know, I don't know of any grants like that. It's a reimbursement base. And then number two is the reality is, it takes money to get more money. And so it comes down to the idea that in Taiwan, although technically when you start a company, you don't need a minimum capital requirement, like paid-in capital. Yes. I think Chinese is called 资本额. And that is something that I think, especially within the foreign community, most people don't quite get, because you can set up companies, in the West pretty easily without any kind of minimum capital. And although in Taiwan it's technically possible, but the traditional thinking is still thinking of paid-in capital as a show of financial strength. And so what people don't usually fail to understand is, like, if you're asking for something like let's say a 3 million NT dollar annual grant, you probably need to have paid-in capital. I would say probably a minimum 10 million NT dollars, right? So it's usually it will be a discount to your actual paid-in capital, right? And so that thinking is still very pervasive in Taiwan.
And do you know if there is there's such like some some like corrections, or at least the government hearing that maybe they should change these laws about this kind of like thinking that they should discount the paid-in capital?
Yeah. I mean, I think the government has already made the changes. So right now there's no paid-in capital, but I think the problem is still attitudinal. That's been the way things have been done. So although technically you don't need any, like, there's no minimum capital requirement, there's no par value to starting a company. Yes. In practice, it's not very practical. So it's not only for the grants, it's also, for example, if you've done banking here in Taiwan, we've had kind of clients who are wiring in their own money, but the bank will say, hey, but your capitalization is so low. How can you keep on running the company with a loss? And the guy will say, the client will say, but it's my own money. I mean, I'm the 100% owner. And then the bank will says, no, I think you're laundering money, right? Something like that, right? So it's in all facets of business. And then if you try to go get a loan as well, right? I mean, you could be doing very well. You could, let's say, maybe your capitalization is only 1 million NT dollars, but you're doing, let's say, 5 or 10 million NT dollars in annual revenue. But the banks will still say, hey, why is your capitalization so low, right? And they're afraid to lend against the revenue. They want to lend against the paid-in capital, right? So I would say that, the Taiwan government has come a long way in terms of making some of these reforms, but the reforms are only effective if it does affect the kind of the general business environment, which unfortunately is slow to change.
Okay, so apart from the capital requirement, I'm sure people will always say, oh, it's hard to raise your capital so that you could increase your chance of getting these funds. Is there some sort of like a way to increase your chance outside that capital requirement?
To be honest, I think it's very difficult. Yeah, I mean, like we've had a number of portfolio companies, and they're Taiwanese, entrepreneurs, and they face the same issues, right? I mean, it's the way the grants work is, the programs are in place, the money is there, right? But the way it's reviewed, a lot of it is also luck. So usually the agency will ask kind of like an independent third party, like a committee to review the idea. But usually they're drawing from academics, right? And so it's really the luck of the draw, right? It's like, you could have a great plan, but on review day, it could be someone who's not familiar, and most likely not familiar with your industry, but their decision on whether you get the grant or not is kind of like final, right? And then I think you're allowed to appeal, and you could do it up to, I think, something like a total of 3 times. But at the end of the day, it's really just the committee needs to buy into what you're doing, right? So I mean, yeah. So I know. Yeah, go ahead.
I personally have an experience with applying for the government funds under the city, and yeah, it's quite the paperwork that's required is really a lot. And at the end of the day, whether regardless of whether you think your idea could work, you're basically in the hands of like the panel who's judging.
Right, that's right.
And it also depends on whether, as you say, whether they're buying what you're actually telling them. So, but I feel like they're also doing their job. I mean, the government is trying to get experts to be in the panel so that they would really evaluate your projects well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's I think I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? So the government takes this seriously. They also put in the time, but I guess it's the age-old kind of paradox, right? Like, is more government better, or is less government better, right? So I mean, usually the way I kind of frame it is, I think, think of it as like, icing on the cake. Let's say if you have funding, and then, and you're going to do this anyway, and, you can apply. If you get the grant, that's great because it's non-dilutive funding. Correct. But I think if you're like wholly dependent on the grants, then that's a very tough game to be in, or a tough situation to be in, right? Because just of the way that grants are structured is reimbursement. So either way, you have to be able to spend money to be able to get the reimbursement. And then secondly, I think for it to be worthwhile, you need the grant to be a certain quantum. But to get to that certain quantum, you need to have like a larger paid-in capital in place.
Yeah, so I think they've also tried to make sure that they could prioritize those startup, at least based on my experience with Citi,
Mhm.
they're
Mhm.
trying to prioritize those startups that have already been recognized abroad. For example, if you
Yeah.
were part of like a Korean accelerator or
Right.
even
Right.
accelerators here in
Yes.
Taiwan, I think your interview schedule gets bumped up, or at least
Right.
they will put that in the notes for the actual interview.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's very Taiwanese in the sense that they like external validation, right? Like if someone else can validate it, then you you pick up brownie points, right? Kind of that concept. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway,
Uh huh.
let's do a fast round.
Sure. Sure.
So basically, I have questions that you haven't seen.
Uh huh.
I'll just ask you, and then give me your best answer. Ready?
Okay. Okay.
What is your daily breakfast?
I skip breakfast. Yeah.
What show are you currently watching on Netflix?
I don't watch Netflix, but my wife is watching Squid Games, or she just
Okay.
finished it.
All right. Are you a
Uh,
morning or night person?
um, I've evolved to become either or both. I used to be a night person.
Are you Android or iOS user?
Android,
Mac or PC?
PC.
Favorite games or board game?
I used to play a lot of blackjack, like as in a casino. Yeah,
Okay. Favorite
yeah.
movie of all time?
Probably Goodwill Hunting,
Favorite book?
Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger from a long time ago.
All right. So yeah, I think that's the end of our show. But before that, we want to help you in our show. So we want to ask you, what's your action items?
No, I mean, no. Thanks for having having me on the show. So, one is, if for any, friends in the foreign community, if you just wanted to kind of talk about business, if you're like kind of stuck, always happy to hear you out. I'm not, I mean, you can't help in all cases, but certainly, I'm open to like a virtual coffee chat. Secondly is, many of our clients are looking for talent, right? Like whether you're a business person or a technical person. So reach out if you're in the market for a job, especially with, I think most of our clients are pretty progressive employers who, pay well and, value the individual. And then third is, I'm still, on the lookout for good ideas. So if you have a good kind of product idea these days, and again, like my criteria is, it makes sense being based out of Taiwan. I love to hear it. I'm these days I'm mostly investing in an angel capacity, and then also happy to help introduce or connect to other investors, right? So,
Wow. So we'll definitely leave the links to your websites and your email on our video descriptions, because you've actually mentioned a lot of good keywords, especially
yeah.
for job creation, for investments
Mhm.
opportunities, as well as help in terms of like visas, and then help with the grants. Again, Mark, thank you for joining our show, and for our audience. We hope that you could spread the word about what we're doing here by subscribing if you haven't done yet. Have a great day.
Thank you,
Thanks, Mark.
thanks for listening. Thanks, Paul.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.